Maybe you won't see a white flag, but essentially that's already what they are. They should wave the white flag of surrender.
The operation is over. Epic Fury, as the president notified Congress, we're done with that stage of it. Okay, we're now on to this project of freedom.
American forces won't need to enter Iranian waters or airspace. It's not necessary. We're not looking for a fight.
So we're saying the Iranians do not have control of the strait. We have absolute control of the strait.
A week ago Friday, the president announced that Iran had agreed to give up their nuclear program, to give up their ballistic missile program, to stop support for terrorist groups, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The only problem with that is literally none of that was true.
So what is true? President Trump says the US is pausing Project Freedom, but that the American blockade of Iran's ports will continue. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, says the offensive stage of the Iran war is over because the US has achieved its objectives. Meanwhile, Iranian state media is hailing all of this as a victory for Tehran. They're calling it a retreat and say the US president is trying to cover up the failure of his operation. In the last 2 months, we've seen a string of dizzying turnabouts in the president's positions on the war. So where does this leave the US now, and what options does the US have left in Iran? Siavush Ranjbar Daimi is going to help me answer that question and several more. He's a senior lecturer in modern Middle Eastern history at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Thanks so much for talking to me about this, Siavush. So we've got President Trump halting Project Freedom after less than 48 hours. Tell us why. Is he claiming that his objectives have been achieved?
Good morning. Yes, well, Trump is full of bluster as usual and engages in his usual sort of rather triumphant rhetoric. He did interrupt this activity quite early on. One reason might be that in the last few minutes, the website access so far in a completely unverified, of course, manner has revealed that both sides are apparently close to a memorandum of understanding which brings the war to an end and starts negotiations. And some of these conditions involve end of the US blockade and end of the Iranian chokehold over the Strait of Hormuz, and substantive negotiations over the nuclear matters. So even though he hasn't said it directly that the deal is so close, but he did mention that negotiations are ongoing. So it could very well be that behind the scenes, things have moved on the diplomatic front, and both sides are in a position to scale back. And Trump wanted to send a signal that things are going in that direction, and therefore he abruptly interrupted an operation which had formally started, as you say, on Monday and hadn't really taken hold yet. We didn't see it enter into a fully operational stage, with only a couple of ships making it through under American assistance, it seems.
We should say that this Axios report hasn't been confirmed. We're just getting this news about this memorandum of understanding from one source. So would you say then that the US administration was hoping that this was going to help bring Iran back to the negotiating table, sort of hoping for a genuine diplomatic opening?
I think what has really appeared to have an effect is the blockade. The blockade has been going on for a while. It has been far, of course, more effective than the American claims and intentions to reopen the Strait of Hormuz for shipping. And this has led to a worsening, considerable, has at least contributed to a considerable worsening of the economic situation in Iran. We've seen a repeated crash of the value of the Iranian currency, the rial. Apparently, there's a liquidity crisis within Iranian banks. The price of basic foodstuffs has skyrocketed, and some of it is connected to the blockade, because it's not just a question of Iranian oil not making it out for the export route, which is primarily China, but it's also essential goods and ingredients for industrial output from China, of course, not making it to Iran or not making it through the shipping route and making it in far lower quantities through other routes, land routes maybe. So that probably has had an effect. I think that is when also the war planning that Iran had and the efficiency with which the 40 days of war were administered by the government starts to falter as a consequence of the duration of this conflict and the lack of access to this shipping route. So that could have been one key thing which I think exercised the Iranian minds towards the sort of concessions that one might see in this, as you say, unconfirmed Axios report.
But of course, Iran is saying that, you know, the ending of Project Freedom is a victory. They're framing it as a victory, aren't they? So you're saying that they needed to come to the table and they needed to take this next step.
Yes, well, I mean, of course, Iran is still on a war rhetoric, is still on a boisterous war rhetoric. And again, if the bar was set as surviving and not being set with an immediate challenge to the rule of the Islamic Republic, they are there, of course, because at the moment also the streets are clear and there is so far little appetite for return to street protests, as we saw in January. And there haven't been, of course, boots on the ground to in sort of a land invasion. And of course, bombing has stopped for the past 4 weeks. So Iran will keep engaging in this war rhetoric and will not frame any concession as a weakness. They will again find a narrative that will emphasize their victory. However, it does seem that all this operation and all this memorandum of understanding relief, and crucially, so far, the details we see do not involve the Strait of Hormuz going through the sort of regime that, for example, the Iranian parliament is saying, a toll system where Iran would pick up war reparations from the transit of ships. So far, what we have seen points towards the return to the sort of status that the Strait of Hormuz had before the start of the conflict. So free passage. Iran's economic relief would come through sanctions relief, and those are, of course, connected to nuclear concessions on the nuclear side. Mm-hmm. So in practical terms, it is a bit different from what was framed in terms of you still hear parliament or hardliners in Iran claiming that the Strait of Hormuz now will have a different sort of regime for into the future. Based on what Axios is putting out, which again needs to be verified, this would not appear to be the case.
Okay. Yeah, just a quick question about how unified Iran is right now. Tehran obviously presenting a united front, but there are competing camps inside the system, particularly within the IRGC and political leadership. You know, are there competing camps over whether to engage or escalate? How strong is that push and pull in Iran?
Well, that push and pull was always there. I mean, there was no real unity on this issue for many decades. And it was always a question of one side or the other getting the upper hand, and at least in the short term engaging, leading the way in terms of its preferred vision of Iran-US relations. That was what happened, of course, a decade ago when President Rouhani managed to push through the JCPOA nuclear deal. But of course, that was short-lived, and then the hardliners went back. So this sort of tension and this sort of confrontation was usually in the past sort of resolved by the intervention of the supreme leader, Khamenei Sr., who of course had the clout and authority to take the final decision and have the final say. That sort of setup is gone now, for sure. Whatever one thinks about the state of health of his son, the problem is that he simply doesn't have yet the authority to make these sort of final decisions. And the level of squabbling and the level of infighting will emerge more and more as the war unity comes to an end. Because, of course, while the country was under bombs and while there was the serious need to engage in military defense and, of course, offense, political divisions were clearly set to aside. But in the past 4 weeks, we've seen them increasing, and they will increase more because again, if Iran is to get war reparations, and remember the Iranian government has pinned that war damages at anything between $270 to $300 billion. That will have to come if, obviously, given that the Strait of Hormuz toll system was always impractical to collect that sort of money, will have to come through concessions on the nuclear issue and sanctions lifting, and the return of the sale of oil on the Iranian oil on the international market in a more or less normal manner, like other oil exporters. that cannot come without substantial nuclear concessions, which is, of course, cycling back to what Trump was always demanding from the Iranians, particularly in terms of uranium enrichment. So clearly, this is a very divisive issue in Iran, one which will probably expose fault lines even more, despite the fact that from an outward point of view, of course, all these different factions have one thing in common, and that is preserving the Islamic Republic, because the perspective of letting in elements of the opposition is a red line for all of them, whether moderate or hardline.
I am hearing now that an unnamed Pakistani source has confirmed that the US and Iran are closing in on a memorandum of understanding. So this does sound like a concrete next step, but it seems like President Trump has been searching for a kind of silver bullet to help him deliver victory over Iran these last months. Do you feel like he has any real understanding of the Islamic Republic and of its negotiation style?
Maybe it doesn't, but we don't really know to what extent the Americans have really engaged deeply with Iran. And of course, any former negotiator will tell you that negotiating with Iran is a very painstaking and process. And at times they even compare it to weaving a complex Iranian carpet in its complexity. But the point remains that Trump really is insisting on, some major Iranian concession on uranium enrichment. Again, if you look at the Axis details, it says that Iran would effectively engage in a 15-year moratorium on the enrichment of uranium at all percentages. And even after that, it would be at 3.67%. Now, the extent to which Iran really is agreeing on this also underlies the extent to which uranium enrichment really was not really a technical aspect of the Iranian nuclear program, but a political one. It was all about ambitions, it was all about projection of power, and it was, of course, a very costly one, because it led Iran to the sort of economic situation and isolation and more that we saw in the post-JCPOA years, particularly, of course, after Trump came out of the JCPOA in 2018. Of course, there are a lot of details here. For example, what happens to the 400 plus kilos of uranium Iran enriched at over 60%, which appears to have been buried in the June 2025 strikes. Again, there's discussion there of extraction. Trump has been very clear on that nuclear dust, as he puts it, needs to be extracted entirely and taken out of Iran. We have to see whether Iran agrees to that. But again, I think a lot depends on the economic aspects, because the economic crisis in Iran is serious. To my extent, it's underreported. People are putting too much emphasis on strategic matters when they look at what the Islamic Republic is engaging in this conflict. And this sort of economic relief might just be the trigger that Iran, willingly or unwillingly, irrespective of the rhetoric you will hear, will have to engage with. Again, if you're faced with a bill that approaches $300 billion in an economy where repatriating oil revenues are very difficult, and the first step that would occur in such a situation, remember, is the unfreezing of billions of dollars in Iranian frozen oil revenue, which are stored all over the world, be it South Korea, Qatar, Europe, and so on and so forth. Economic necessity might drive these matters. And of course, when you get to this point, it is debatable that whether you really need a very deep knowledge of the mindset of Iranian negotiators, at least to achieve an initial framework within which more detailed negotiations can occur at conditions which are workable. And of course, if Trump eventually does manage to get the uranium enrichment out on a 10+ year moratorium, again, all needs to be verified. That is his off ramp, if you want.
One question, Siavash, about Chinese influence. China's foreign minister Wang Yi met his Iranian counterpart Abbas Araghchi for talks in Beijing on Wednesday. Is China positioning itself as a kind of alternative power broker as part of this situation?
Well, China clearly has every interest in solving this. First of all, it has very extensive business with the United States. We have this upcoming important summit between Trump and Xi Jinping in Beijing. For many years, it has acted as Iran's economic sort of savior, if you want, engaging in imports of Iranian oil, mostly for political reasons, without having actual necessity to do so. It could probably have obtained the same amount of oil from elsewhere, but it chose to do this because of clear strategic concerns. And one could argue smart strategic concerns, because it has given China considerable leverage within the Iranian system. But of course, that has its problems. It's a headache for China, because only specific refineries that are outside the trade system with the United States can actually pick up this oil. Otherwise, they're subject to sanctions. And of course, there's a complex financial system underpinning this export of oil. And Iran, of course, does not get the sort of revenue they would get from selling the oil on the normal market. So China, of course, wants, I think, to see this settled before Trump arrives to Beijing in one way or the other, or at least have them engaging in the further stages of this memorandum of understanding as it comes. Because, of course, but we shouldn't forget that while much is made of the strategic ties between Iran and China and the sort of choreography you see today with Arokchi being in Beijing, the volume of trade that China has with the United States is simply uncomparable to the sort of economic interest that China has in Iran. And I think that's what I always heard from Iranian officials. Is very interested. We know that China is very connected to us. The relationship you see publicly, but at the end of the day, their interests when it comes to America are more. And probably what China wants now is some form of end to this, so it can really focus more clearly on its own relationship with the United States.
So in summary, Siavash, given the situation as it is, given that we are hearing about this memorandum of understanding, where is the US right now in terms of its negotiating power, its leverage in the Middle East? What's your assessment?
Well, I mean, the goalposts have shifted a lot in the past few months, so it really depends on what the parameter for comparison is here. I mean, back in January or even February, the whole idea was regime change, was Israel and the United States going in to bring down the Islamic Republic. Then, of course, things shifted as this idea of doing it via aerial bombardment proved to be elusive. The Strait of Hormuz situation suddenly kicked in, and nobody was thinking about such a situation, up to the end of February. So now, if I guess the objective is freeing up Hormuz and, more importantly, the transit through the Strait of Hormuz, regaining the confidence of shippers that they can transit through the Strait of Hormuz without paying tolls or without following Iranian instructions, ultimately at least, maybe not immediately. And of course, some arrangement at the uranium enrichment front, which at least gives some credence to Trump's rather obsessive as well, I would say, mantra that Iran should have no nuclear weapons, and this nuclear dust, as he puts it, must come out, and that sort of rhetoric and pledges. Then maybe that's where the United States will call it a day at this particular conflict. But of course, none of this, as I see it, really satisfies Israel. The problem is that we have a very important actor in all of this that's clearly not taking part in these negotiations, won't be involved if people are sitting down and talking in Islamabad, of course. So where exactly does Israel stand in this? Does it simply accept that its initial objectives came up short? Its systematic destruction of Iranian state infrastructure or civilian infrastructure, and more ultimately did not result in any sort of substantial tilting of the political sort of aspects of this conflict towards itself. Its lack of penetration within Iranian society at large, the fact that we don't really see evidence of great popularity for Israel after all it did in 2025 and 2026 within Iranian society. So where does this leave Israel? This remains a question which, of course, this memorandum of understanding does not address at all. We go by the idea that, if the U.S. engages seriously with Iran and reaches some sort of agreement, then Israel will have to toe the line. We'll have to see to what extent this will actually hold in the near future.
Siavash Ranjba-Daimi from the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Siavash, thank you so much for talking to us today. So Donald Trump has paused Project Freedom, and the US and Iran are closing in on a one-page memo to end the war. This is what a Pakistani source involved in the peace efforts told the Reuters news agency, confirming a report in Axios. But it is still unclear whether this is going to be a lasting resolution to the conflict or just a temporary lull. How do you see the situation developing? Do you think this is the beginning of the end of the war in Iran? Let us know in the comments, and remember, you can find more news on our website. That's dw.com. I'm Anya Coopers-McKinnon. Thanks for being with us.